Good morning. So this week's Parsha is Va'et Hanan. Va'et Hanan means, it's one of the harder ones to pronounce. It means, and I prayed. And it refers to Moshe saying how he prayed to Hashem, asking for permission to go into the promised land after Hashem told him, because he sinned at the waters of Meribah, a story of its own. He will not get to go into the promised land. He prayed to Hashem and begged him for to be the ability to go into the land, and Hashem refused him, did not allow him to go. He then warns the people what happened when they worshipped idols. They were punished by Hashem, and warns them against turning away from Hashem. And it will be multiple generations in the land, and you'll kind of forgotten the Exodus, or you'll move away from the Exodus, and it will be hard to remember. And you've got to then make sure that your grandchildren remember Hashem, who has taken you out of Egypt. And because if you do not remember him and you worship idols, you will be thrown off the land. He points out that at Sinai we were shown Hashem, we got to see his presence, everyone got to experience it, and that has to continue, that knowledge of Hashem has to continue from generation to generation. Then the Torah continues telling us how Moshe separated 3 of the 6 cities of refuge, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, that those that kill accidentally will run there in order to and must stay there until the death of the high priest. So 3 of them would be east of the Jordan, 3 west of the Jordan. Moshe is now east of the Jordan, so he separated the 3 east of the Jordan. He then begins his second speech. The beginning, he's giving speeches before his death. He gives his second and longest speech, where he begins by calling the people, reminding them how they stood at Mount Sinai, and reminding them how Hashem said the 10 Commandments. He repeats the 10 Commandments. There's a handful of variations from the original version of the 10 Commandments, the way they were said. They're recorded in Parshat Yitro in the book of Exodus. And then he reminds them how they, the reason why they only heard 10 was because Hashem, they found it too much, too overwhelming, and they came to Moshe and they said, we can't handle it anymore. We don't want to hear anymore. You go to Hashem, you get the rest for us, and we will do whatever he tells us. Moshe was disappointed that they did not want to hear directly from Hashem. Hashem told Moshe, do not worry. That is, if only they will, my goal was to give them appreciation, awe for me, and if only they continue to have this awe and awareness of Hashem for future generations. And then he continues to warn the people about how when they come to the promised land to always remain faithful to Hashem. The Parsha in the 6th reading has the Shema prayer, or it's really not really a prayer, it's really a statement, where we state Hashem, hear Israel, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one, and includes a number of very important mitzvahs, loving Hashem, studying the Torah, teaching your children, wearing the tefillin, and putting mezuzahs on your doors. Then it concludes, again, warning the people when you come into the promised land, make sure to destroy all the idols that are found over there. So that is the Parsha in short. And this week, in addition to talking about the Parsha, we already spoke about the upcoming fast day of Tisha B'Av. In brief, we're already in the 3 weeks. So we spoke about that 3 weeks ago. We're in a 3-week period of mourning between when Jerusalem was breached, the walls of Jerusalem were breached, and the destruction of the temple. And so that date that we mark the destruction of the temple is going to be this coming Monday evening and Tuesday. And so it's a fast called Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah tells us that it commemorates 5 things that happened on this day. Firstly, it is the day when the spies returned, the days of Moshe, saying that the land is too well fortified and the people too strong for us to be able to conquer, and the people did not want to go into the land. And as a result, they ended up spending an extra 40 years in the desert. And so then years later, the second event that happened on this day was the first temple was destroyed on this day, more than 800 years later. Then the second temple was destroyed on this day, second temple in Jerusalem. Then the city of Jerusalem itself was plowed over, was raised, the Temple Mount was plowed over, and the city of Jerusalem was raised on this day by King Hadrian, about some 50 years or so after the destruction of the temple. And then a couple years later, the Jews rebelled again, and the rebellion was brutally crushed, and they made their last stand in Beitar, south of Jerusalem. And the Beitar fell also on this day of Tisha B'Av. There are many other calamities that befell our people on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, notably the Alhambra decree, the requiring all Jews to leave Castile and Aragon, or Spain, in 1492. The date given was August 1st, which that year was Tisha B'Av. And many, many other events in our history, tragedies that happened on Tisha B'Av. So we mark this day as a day of mourning, where firstly, we afflict ourselves as we do on Yom Kippur. So the same prohibitions on Yom Kippur are on Tisha B'Av, as mourning for the temple. To Yom Kippur, we do it for other reasons. It's not a sad day. It's rather a solemn day, a day of spirituality. But Tisha B'Av, it's for mourning. So firstly, we do not eat and drink for the entire Tisha B'Av from before sundown on Monday night, which I believe is 7:43, I think, on Monday night, until it's fully dark on Tuesday, which is at about, when you can see 3 stars, which is about 8:08 p.m. So for just over 24 hours, we don't eat or drink. Make sure to eat well beforehand. If someone needs to take medications, then maybe or someone diabetic or has some other reason where they need to eat is different. But if anyone who's healthy should be able to do it, just make sure to hydrate yourself well beforehand and eat well beforehand on Monday. And we also, in addition to not eating or drinking, the questions at the end. In addition to not eating or drinking, we also, like Yom Kippur, do not wash or bathe ourselves. We do wash our hands as we do every morning when we wake up, but we only wash, or we only wash our hands until our knuckles. Same if we use the bathroom, we wash our hands only till our knuckles. Otherwise, we do not shower, we do not bathe throughout this entire 24 plus hours. The third thing, we do not put any ointments, lotions, makeup on over Tisha B'Av. You can put on before Tisha B'Av, but not on Tisha B'Av itself. Similar again to Yom Kippur. A fourth thing, we do not wear leather shoes. We can wear other shoes that are not leather, but we're forbidden from wearing leather shoes. And that's because until fairly recently, leather shoes were the only kind of comfortable shoes that they had. But it remains the prohibition is only leather shoes. And then finally, we abstain from all sexual activity during these 24 hours. And so those 5 things are 5 prohibitions on Yom Kippur that we also do on Tisha B'Av. In addition, given that it's a day of mourning, we act as if we are mourners who are sitting Shiva. And so therefore, firstly, for the entire day, and starting even from the afternoon before Tisha B'Av, we do not study Torah. We only study parts related to Tisha B'Av or to the laws of mourning or tragedies that befell our people. Also, from nightfall tomorrow night, 7:43, until midday, which is about 1 o'clock on Tuesday, we sit on a low stool, as people who are sitting Shiva do as well. So those are things that are done. We also do not work. As someone who's sitting Shiva does not work. If one needs to, one can work in the afternoon after 1 p.m., but until 1 p.m., we don't work either. So this is all part of kind of the mourning, for the mourning the destruction of the temple and the tragedies that went along with it. Before Tisha B'Av begins, first you should eat well beforehand, hydrate yourself very well. But we have what we call a Sudam Mafseket, or a final meal, the last meal before Tisha B'Av. In this final meal, the custom is that we sit on the floor. It's a mournful meal. We eat by ourselves, not in a group. We sit on the floor and we eat bread. We dip the bread into ashes, which reminds us, of course, of the destruction of the temple. You don't have to eat the ashes, just dip it into ashes. And we also eat a hard-boiled egg, which is also food that when you sit Shiva, you have your first meal, you eat a hard-boiled egg. So we have that just the final meal, and that's it, just that right before Tisha B'Av begins. All again as a sign of mourning. Monday night, we have services in the synagogue. It's a short evening service. Following the evening service, we read the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. We all sit on the floor or sit on low stools, and we read the book of Lamentations. And following that, we recite a handful of kinot of, I think the English word is elegies, which are poems of mourning that we have mourning the various tragedies. We're going to have services here at 8:10 p.m. And then Tuesday we'll have services here. Somewhat of a long service at 10 a.m. and we have a long service at 10 a.m. Where we read the Torah, and we also recite many about 55 or so kinot of these. 35 or so of these kinot, of these poems. So it takes a very long time. They go through many different tragedies that happened to our people over the years that they wrote poems about over the years of our history. We also, for men that wear the talit and tefillin every morning, we don't wear a talit and tefillin on the morning of Tisha B'Av during morning services as we usually do. Instead, we wear it in the afternoon. So we put on our talit and tefillin only in the afternoon, and we wear it for the evening services. So that's a little about Tisha B'Av in short, and then the fast ends on Tuesday, as I mentioned, at about 8:08 p.m. And after that, you're welcome to eat. We still continue to observe the prohibitions of the 9 days, which is not to, as we've mentioned, not to travel, not to swim for leisure, not to eat meat or drink wine, and we continue observing that till midday on Wednesday, which is about 1 p.m. since we're on daylight savings time. Let me take some questions about the Parsha or about Tisha B'Av. Yes, Louis?
When did the rabbis start Tisha B'Av?
That's a very good question. The fasts, all of our primary fast days started following the destruction of the first temple, when the first temple was destroyed. And it's already mentioned in the prophecy of Zechariah. But it was probably not widely observed during the Second Temple period, once the Second Temple was built, but it was renewed after the destruction of the Second Temple.
So you're saying it was suspended for 300 plus years?
400 plus years.
400 plus years?
Yes.
And then
renewed
after the year 67?
Mm-hmm.
It was started.
It was renewed after year 70, yes. Any other questions? Yes. Excellent. Any others? Okay. So then I should also mention that this coming Shabbat is known as Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbat of comfort, because it's after the morning of the 3 weeks, the morning of Tisha B'Av. We read a Haftorah that begins with the words Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, comfort my people. And following Tisha B'Av, we then move into a time of joy as we prepare for the high holidays, which are coming up in about 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks actually. So let me get straight to today's topic. Because in the theme of Tisha B'Av, which marks Jewish tragedies, and we've had many such tragedies over the years, and in the poems that we read at the services on Tisha B'Av, we read about many of the different tragedies that happened to our people over the years. Many poems are written to commemorate specific tragedies. So today, in that spirit, we will talk about one continuous tragedy that had to do with one particular accusation known as the blood libels. A blood libel is a false accusation against a religious group claiming that they kill other people for ritual purposes. So blood libels have been used over history against various groups, but it's been primarily used over the past about 800-900 years against Jews. The first record we have of anti-Jewish blood libels actually comes from Josephus. Josephus was a Jew who was part of the rebellion that led to the destruction of the temple. He ended up changing sides and switching to the Romans, and he later wrote a very important book about the destruction that gives us a lot of information about the destruction. Maybe one day we could do a class about Josephus. But he wrote a number of books, and he wrote a book called Against Apion. Apion was a Greek living in Egypt, who at that time Egypt was the center of scholarship in the Roman Empire, and he was a vicious anti-Semite, and he wrote an anti-Semitic book. And we don't have his book, but we do have the rebuttal that was written by Josephus called Against Apion. And everything we know about Apion's book comes from quotes that Josephus quotes him, because Josephus' book Against Apion has survived. So he quotes Apion over there as writing how the Greek king Antiochus, that's the one who banned Jewish practice and persecuted Jews, and that persecution led to an uprising that we celebrate every year on Hanukkah. So he writes that when this Greek king Antiochus came into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, he found over there a Greek man sitting in a room with a table full of delicacies and wonderful food. And after questioning him, the man said that where he was being fed all this wonderful food, and he's being held there for months until he gets fattened up, and then he's going to be slaughtered by the Jews as part of their celebration. So Josephus shows in his book, in his rebuttal, how ridiculous this statement is. Jews don't slaughter humans. No one other than Kohanim are allowed into the temple. No food is brought into the temple. So this whole statement is ridiculous many times over. And yet, it was employed, it was used. A later 10th century Greek anti-Semite called Democritus also accused Jews of slaughtering non-Jews for ritual purposes when the temple stood. So there seems to have been this accusation already in ancient times. Interestingly, early Christians who were persecuted by the Romans were accused of killing non-Christian children for ritual purposes. In other words, we have records in early times of Christians being accused of blood libels. Unfortunately, later they turned that accusation onto Jews. So the first recorded blood libel that we have was in England. In 1144, there was a boy called William of Norwich who was killed. And a Jewish convert to Christianity by the name of Theobald of Cambridge claimed that every year world Jewry makes a lottery to decide which Jewish community should kill a Christian child for ritual purposes. And that year, Norwich had been chosen. So the Bishop of Norwich rejected the accusation and protected the Jews of Norwich, allowing them to come into his own castle. However, William himself was declared a martyr and a saint, and he was buried in the cathedral in Norwich, and it became a local shrine that people would come to pray, as Catholics do, at the graves of saints. So, and it turned out that blood libels, this being the first that we know of at least, was a great way to create local saints. And in the Catholic world, having a local saint was very good business for the local church, because it meant that pilgrims would come to visit the grave of the local saint. And when they come, of course, they would bring charity with them and give it to the local church. So it was a good business, and a blood libel was a great way to create your own local saint. And it appears that in medieval times, many Catholic priests had tried or attempted to create their own local saints. Most, by the way, of which were never recognized by the official church, but they still created them, and they were often worshipped locally. There were similar accusations in 1168 in Gloucester, in 1181 in Edmonds, and in 1183 in Bristol. These are all towns in England that had Jewish communities that all, in each instance, a dead child was declared a martyr and a saint, having been killed for ritual purposes by Jews, and their grave became a place of local pilgrimage. Now, as far as we know, none of these accusations led to the harming of the local Jewish communities. Not that the Jewish communities at the time were not harmed. Jews in England went through many different massacres not related to the blood libels. And there were a number of such massacres in England. However, the blood libels, as far as we know, did not lead to any massacres at this point. They were rather simply a business opportunity for the local churches to create their own local saint and allow and bring pilgrims to their church. But from England, the blood libel quickly moved to mainland Europe, which with much, much more violent consequences. So during the Second Crusade in 1147, when they were really killing Jews regardless, and not all historians count this as a blood libel, crusaders in Würzburg in southern Germany claimed that Jews had killed someone for ritual purposes, and when they rounded up a number of Jews in Würzburg and killing 21 Jews. The first case, though, of a local government, not just kind of local people or crusaders, but of a local government arresting and trying Jews for the accusation of ritual murder, was in 1171 in Blois, France. And they arrested at the time 48 Jews in Blois, all of whom were burned at stake, including, not just men, including 17 women. The date that those Jews were killed, the 20th of Sivan, was declared a fast day for Ashkenazic Jews by Rabbeinu Tam, the spiritual leader of Ashkenazic Jews at the time. That was kept for some time. Later it was, as Jews moved away from France, they stopped keeping it, but later that date, the 20th of Sivan, will be renewed because it was also an important date of the destruction of the city of Nemirov during the 1648-1649 massacres that we spoke about a couple weeks ago. And so later that fast day is going to be renewed. King Louis VII, King of France at the time, responded to this trial and killing of Jews by declaring his protection of the Jews of France. Jews were his property, something that many kings in Europe tended to declare. The local populace didn't like them. Often local rulers would give in to the whims of the local populace. The kings needed them because they were good taxpayers. They paid an enormous amount of taxes. And so the kings were often claimed control of the Jews, and you're not allowed to touch the Jews without the king's permission. Didn't always work. Blood libels, however, continued, particularly during the 12th, 13th centuries in Germany. And here's just a partial list that we have from recorded history. It's probably many, many instances that were not recorded, just to give you an idea of how pervasive it was. In 1179, there was a blood libel in Beauport, Germany. In 1194, in Erfurt, Germany, 5 Jewish families were killed. In 1277, in Nikolsburg, today in Czechia. In 1228, in Breslau, today in Poland. In 1235, in Lauda. In 1235, there was a blood libel in Fulda, which led to the death of 34 Jews. That year, by the way, in 1235, the Emperor Frederick II issued a proclamation that blood libels are false and should not be believed and should never be used. But it didn't help much. In 1241, there was another blood libel in Breslau. In 1243, in Belitz in Germany, many Jews were killed. In 1247, in Valery in France, many Jews were killed. In 1255, back in England, Jews in Lincoln were accused of killing an 8-year-old boy called Hugh. And known as Hugh of Lincoln, the boy himself, of course, became a martyr and a saint. But the Jews of Lincoln were all arrested. And when King Henry III passed through Lincoln a few months later, he had one of the Jews who was accused as the primary suspect by the name of Copen. He had him executed. He had the rest of the Jews sent to London and imprisoned in the Tower of London. 18 of them were executed. The rest of them were eventually pardoned. And Hugh of Lincoln became another saint with, of course, a local shrine built for him. In 1267, there was a blood libel in Pforzheim, Germany, where many Jews were killed. In 1270 in Wissembourg in France. In 1283 in Mainz, where 10 Jews were killed. The same year, 1283, there was a blood libel in Bachrach, Germany, where 26 Jews were killed. In 1285, there was a blood libel in Munich that led into a pogrom in which 180 Jews were killed. In 1287, there was a blood libel in Oberwessel in Germany, which led to pogroms across Germany. And in the blood libel in Oberwessel, they embalmed the body of the girl who was killed, and they kept her in a church with the claim that anyone who touched her would immediately be healed. This is again the Middle Ages when they had all these, beliefs. So King Rodolph, who wanted to bring an end to these pogroms and protect the Jews, the king of Germany at the time, of what was called then the Holy Roman Empire, ordered her body to be burned so that the pogroms should stop, and declared again blood libels to be false. So they continue, these blood libels continue throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Almost every other year there's a blood libel recorded in some other town. And there's lists you could find books about blood libels where they list, there's hundreds of them that we have recorded, many of which led to deaths of various people accused, or sometimes whole communities. Perhaps the most notable of these medieval blood libels was Simon of Trent. Trent is in Italy. He was a 2-year-old boy who was killed and declared a martyr, and all the Jews of Trent were killed as a result of this. They rounded up all the Jews of Trent, and they murdered all of them. Pope Sixtus the Sixth, protested the killing of the Jews of Trent, and even while the trials were ongoing, he attempted to stop the trials, sent representatives of the Vaticans to oversee the trials, but he was largely unsuccessful. They didn't listen to him. They killed the Jews anyway. The boy became a saint, even though the Catholic Church banned, even though the Catholic Church refused to recognize it. And this boy, this 2-year-old boy, had an entire cult of worship that continued in Italy, where every year they would have a whole procession in his honor, and people would come to him, and there were various kind of rites that they would perform over there in Trent. And that lasted until the mid-20th century. Although the Catholic Church officially did not endorse it, and attempted many times to stop it, it continued until it was finally taken apart, not till the 1960s. So these blood libels continued over the coming centuries, spreading, and by the 15th century, it had spread beyond Western Europe. It spread to Spain, Portugal by the 14th, 15th centuries, and then it moved to Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Russia. Everywhere we see these blood libels popping up here and there. A child or sometimes an adult is killed. Sometimes they just disappear, and later they're found to still be alive, and Jews are accused of ritual murder. Sometimes someone claims that they saw it. Sometimes it's just out of a hypothesis. Often Jews are tortured and forced to admit to it. Sometimes they do under torture, and then they implicate then other Jews as well in it. And sometimes those implicated are killed. Sometimes whole communities are wiped out as a result. But it's something that continues again and again and again. Any questions?
What they claim the rituals, the Jewish rituals are, I know I've heard and read about, they thought that the Jews drink the blood.
There were various different claims over the years. It wasn't the same each one. So what did they claim? Sometimes they claimed Jews drank the blood. Sometimes they claimed that it was a reenactment of the killing of the founder of Christianity. Sometimes they claimed that it was to use in their matzah. So it was always various different claims. But it was what they all have in common is a claim of ritual murder.
Ritual murder.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they did things with the bodies.
Well, it always involved draining the blood from the bodies. So blood libels were persistent across time and place in Europe for more than 800 years. They were generally, however, the result of accusations by commoners and local leadership, meaning either just the masses, or if it was the government or the church, which were often synonymous depending in different times and places in Europe. In other words, the church was the government. But if it was the government or the church, it was virtually always local leaders. And it's clear, looking at the history of blood libels, that the higher-ups, the kings, the usually the archbishops or the higher-up levels of the Catholic Church, or later the Orthodox Church, were generally opposed to it, were strongly opposed to it. Multiple kings of France, Germany, later Poland attempted to stop it. Henry III of England is the only king that we know of who actually supported, in medieval times, who actually supported a blood libel. Generally, the kings were strongly opposed to it. That's despite they were anti-Semites. That doesn't mean that they were Jew lovers. Some were, but many were anti-Semites. And even so, they were strongly opposed to the blood libel. Not a single pope, although many popes were vicious anti-Semites, not a single pope ever supported blood libels, and many popes issued edicts against the blood libels over the years. The Catholic Church's official position is blood libels are garbage, and always was, that blood libels are garbage and not true. We'll soon talk about the cause of the blood libels and why it is that at the top of the power chain, at the top of the leadership in Europe, were generally opposed to it despite being anti-Semites. But keep in mind that while the church, the Catholic Church that is, and political leaders in Europe throughout the ages were generally anti-Semitic and hated Jews and persecuted Jews and enacted anti-Jewish laws and rules against Jews and even expelled Jews and the like, they generally didn't believe in killing Jews. The Catholic Church always believed it was theologically wrong to kill Jews, and to persecute them, okay, but not to kill them. And the kings generally also believed it wrong to kill Jews, both because mass killing is never good in your kingdom because it just leads to chaos and no one wants that. And as well as because Jews served a purpose in the kingdom. There was a reason why they were there generally. They served the financial purpose. And so they didn't want Jews killed. The pogroms, rather, were generally spontaneous outbursts of the masses that were opposed by the church and leadership. The only real exception is going to be later in the 19th century in the Russian Empire, where the Russian Empire officially supported pogroms and, at least to some extent, supported blood libels as well. That's really the only exception. But despite the leadership being against the blood libels, both political leadership and the Catholic Church, they failed to stop them, and blood libels persisted, despite the official positions of the kings and the Catholic Church. So blood libels persisted even into the 18th, 19th centuries, even as we're thinking modern times. Jews are being given emancipation in different places. We have freedoms, particularly here in the United States, in Western Europe, in France, in England, later in Germany. There are, in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, people are given freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. And even so, there's elections, democracy is coming to the world. Blood libels surprisingly still persist. They become more controversial, though. They were always controversial, even in the Catholic world, but they still persist. So I want to talk about and throughout the 19th century, there were countless blood libels all across Europe and beyond, as we'll see in a moment. But I want to talk about three particular 19th century and 20th century blood libels that were that were unique in their own ways. So one of the most notable blood libels was the 1840 blood libel in Damascus. Jews of Damascus were accused of killing, by Christians in Damascus, of killing Damascus in Syria, of killing a Christian monk by the name of Thomas, Father Thomas. The accusations were led by the French consul to Damascus, who was a vicious anti-Semite. His name was Ulysses de Ratimenton. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. And so as a result of this, the Arab rulers of Damascus. At the time, Damascus was under a semi-autonomous rule of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, based in Egypt. And the Arab leaders arrested the Arabs arrested many Jewish leaders, tortured them, and some admitted to accusations under torture. And you have to understand at this time, the 19th century, European countries were very, very powerful, and European ambassadors and consuls in non-European countries had a huge say over what happened in these particular countries. They often had troops. They were very impactful in trade, and they had a huge say of what happened. And so if the French and other European consuls were encouraging it, the Arabs followed. As a result, Christians and Arabs rioted in the Jewish quarter, killing many Jews and destroying synagogues. The accusations in Damascus attracted, for some reason, although there were many other blood libels at the same time, for some reason these accusations attracted the attention of European newspapers and American newspapers and were widely reported. And many Jewish leaders at the time, most notably Sir Moses Montefiore, who was the president of British Jewry at the time, and wealthy Jew who did a lot to save Jews, help Jews around the world, as well as French lawyer Adolphe Crémieux, who was a famous French Jewish lawyer and activist. They went to Damascus to plead for the Jews, and those who were still alive as a result were released. The Damascus affair, as it's known, highlighted the fact that in the Ottoman Empire, until this point, Jews suffered more from Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and there were a lot of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, than they did from Muslims. Jews suffered more from Christians than from Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. Not that Muslims were great. They suffered from Muslims too, but the anti-Semitism was much stronger at the hands of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. That would change later in the 20th century, but until the 20th century, that was true. It brought the blood libel to world attention, with Western countries widely deriding the accusation. Here in the United States, it galvanized the very small Jewish community at the time in 1840. There were about 15,000 Jews living here, but the Jewish community organized, and probably the first time the American Jewish community ever organized together as a group, and sent Jewish leaders to the State Department, where they lobbied for the American government to pressure the Ottomans or the Egyptian autonomous Egyptian rulers to free the Jews and allow the Jews to go. And indeed, the United States did lobby, had their local consuls lobby for the Jews in Damascus. So in a way, this Damascus affair marks the beginning of the American Jewish community. It also taught the Muslims a new thing that they didn't know about: blood libels. And it really marks the beginning of Muslim blood libels. And starting from 1840, we see countless blood libels in the Muslim world, around the Muslim world, where Jews throughout the Muslim world are accused of killing Muslim kids for ritual reasons. Another notable blood libel was in 1899 in Polna, which is a town in the Czech Republic, today in the Czech Republic. At the time, it was part of the Austrian Empire, which was Central European and considered fairly modern and forward-thinking. It had an emperor, but there was a democratic parliament. A 19-year-old Catholic girl was found murdered. So the 23-year-old homeless Jew, troubled homeless Jew who was mentally incompetent, by the name of Leopold Hilsner, who was accused as murdering her for ritual reasons, that he had been hired by the Jewish community to murder her for ritual reasons. Now, this is 1899, fairly modern times, right, when you think of it, and in a fairly modern country, the Austrian Empire, where they had what we'd call today a modern Western judicial system with lawyers, and torture was no longer allowed, and proper lawyers and juries, and he was tried. This Leopold Hilsner was tried in Austrian courts, and it was the first time, perhaps the only time, that a blood libel was tried in a modern Western judicial system, where the accused, the motive for the murder, the prosecutors declared motive for the murder is ritual purposes. And so this trial garnered a lot of media attention, both in the Austrian Empire and beyond. And he was convicted of the murder for ritual purposes. The murder was appealed, the conviction was appealed, and it was thrown out by the Supreme Court of the Austrian Empire in Vienna. He was then, however, retried for murder without ritual murder being the motive. And he was again convicted. The emperor at the time commuted his death sentence to life in prison. However, many prominent lawyers, especially Jewish lawyers at the time, pointed out that the entire case was built on lies, was built on anti-Semitism. It was small town Czechia, which it was kind of, still today, I mean, you would say small town would be less sophisticated. They were less sophisticated. They were still had not yet arrived in the modern era, and still didn't appreciate, they still didn't appreciate the horrors of anti-Semitism and blood libels. And so much was written on it, and many books written on it at the time, arguing, and it remained controversial because most forward-thinking, smart people understood that it was a false accusation. It wasn't until 1918, just before the end of World War I, that Hilsner was finally pardoned by the final emperor of Austria. Perhaps the most famous of all blood libels was the Libels case in 1911. Now, throughout the 19th century, there were countless blood libels in the Russian Empire, many of which made it to trial with the support of the Russian government. The Russian government was one of those governments that was their policy, they had a policy of anti-Semitism. Their policy was to persecute Jews in every way possible, and they also, at various times, encouraged pogroms, encouraged the populace to attack Jews. So it was a horrific place, a horrific time for Jews. And so there were countless blood libels, many of them making it to trial with the support of the government, right? In 1911, a boy called Andrei Yuchinsky disappeared just outside of Kiev. He was later found murdered in a nearby cave. Someone stepped forward and claimed that they saw Jews murdering him. So Mendel Bayless was a foreman in a nearby factory, and he was charged with the murder. And the Russian media widely carried this story, calling it a ritual murder. And there was this large debate in the Russian media as to whether Jews are involved in ritual murder, or even more so, much of the government-controlled media, right? It was a totalitarian state. Much of the government-controlled media arguing, what is the Russian state going to do about putting an end to Jewish ritual murder? And in fact, it even made it all the way to the Russian parliament, which had a discussion about what the Russian government needs to do to put an end to Jewish ritual murder. So the case was widely watched in Russia because of their interest and the Russian government's interest in accusing Jews of being widely involved in ritual murder. And it was widely watched outside of the Russian Empire because most of the Western world was horrified by how anti-Semitic the Russians could be. So the case was widely watched. It was modern times where such a public case gets widespread media coverage, with many media sending journalists, sending reporters to Kiev to cover the case, and so it was widely reported. The Jewish community of Russia at the time came together, built an A-list team, a defense team for Mendel Bayless. And much of the public trial went over many weeks. It was a long trial, and much of the prosecutor's time was spent not focusing on the details of the murder, but focusing on proving the motive, proving that ritual murder is something that Jews do, and showing the long history, hundreds and hundreds of previous examples of ritual murder, many Jews who had been convicted in the Russian Empire of ritual murder, and showing countless experts on Judaism, anti-Semitic experts on Judaism, claiming that they know that Jews are involved in ritual murder, and that was what much of the case was about. The Jews worked to defend both the accusation against Mendel Bayless that he himself was involved in the murder, and the accusation of ritual murder in general. When the defense rested their case, the judge instructed the jury to come back with a verdict both on Mendel Bayless's whether he was guilty or innocent, as well as a verdict on whether Jews are involved in ritual murder. And so the jury came back, the jury of 12 Christians, acquitted Mendel Bayless of murder, but they could not come to an agreement on the question as to whether Jews participate in ritual murder or not. The case was a reminder for the world on how backwards Russia was and the horrors of anti-Semitism.
Well, this was Ukraine, you said in Kiev.
This is in Kiev, but it was part of the Russian Empire at the time. Part of the Russian Empire. And it was a very prominent case that was widely covered in Russian media and in foreign media across the world. So it's important to understand what is wrong with the blood libels. It's not just they are false, that Jews, of course, don't have and never had any form of ritual murder. And there has never been, often anti-Semites will say, well, it's not all Jews, it's some sects of Jews. In the Bayless case, they said, well, we know it's not all Jews, it's Hasidim that do it. Right? They pointed out that the Hasidic movement had only started by that point a little over 100 years earlier. There had been blood libels going on for 800 years. But it's just a small group. It's a small sect of Jews. So Jews have never been, that's what they claim. But Jews have never been involved in ritual murder. It's false. But that's not the issue. It's not just a false accusation that's led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews over the years and so much suffering. The problem is much worse. The very accusation itself is anti-Semitic. Having to defend yourself from an outrageous accusation already is offensive. You're put on the defense over something that you're not even remotely possible that you would have done. It's the equivalent of going to someone and asking them, why do you beat your spouse? And they can try to defend themselves that they don't. But the very fact that you've raised that accusation itself means that they are capable of being violent, capable of violence against their spouse. The fact that you raise the accusation itself is offensive. And defending that accusation is just allowing yourself to be offended further. It's offensive to even defend such an accusation. And so therefore it's important to understand that it's not about being a false accusation. There's often false accusations. Often people are falsely charged for crimes they didn't commit. It's not just a false accusation. It's not just an accusation against the Jewish people as opposed to against an individual. It's an accusation where you're accusing a group of something that they're not capable of, they're not even remotely possible of. It's absurd, it's outrageous. The accusation itself is offensive. And understanding that, we realize what causes these anti-Semitic blood libels. To believe in a blood libel, you have to believe then, in other words, you believe that a particular individual could possibly have murdered for ritual purposes. You would have to believe that it's not an outrageous and absurd accusation. In other words, you only accuse things that are in the realm of possibility. So if you believe in a blood libel or even accuse someone of a blood libel, that means by definition you don't believe that it's outrageous or absurd. In other words, you believe that it is possible that Jews do something. It's only a question of do they actually do it. Like the example I gave, if you accuse someone of beating their spouse, by definition you believe them to be a violent person who is capable of such a thing. And then it's a question of whether they did it or not. But by making such an accusation, you're insinuating that you think that they are or they likely are a violent person. People can only believe in the possibility of blood libels or of Jewish ritual murder because they believe that Jews are devils or demonic, horrible people who could do such a thing. You need to first demonize Jews and believe Jews to be demonic, to be devils, to be horrific individuals, not regular humans, in order to be able to believe such an accusation. So, and that explains this. So there's a step before the blood libel, and that is the demonization of Jews. And that explains why political leaders and the church generally rejected blood libels. They hated Jews. They believed that Jews were going to be damned for eternity and should be persecuted. This is the Catholic Church. But they also recognized that Jews were generally peaceful, honest people. Anyone who was intelligent, anyone who was thought for themselves, recognized that Jews were regular people. Anyone who interacted with Jews in a regular way, in a normal way, recognized that they were normal, healthy people. Blood libels were only possible in a reality where Jews are demonized. Today, most people in Western countries understand that blood libels are absurd and outrageous, anti-Semitic accusations. And yet there remain a significant number of Americans and people in Western countries who believe that Jews practice ritual murder. And they'll often say, not all Jews, it's just some Jews, it's just some sects of Jews, but there are still plenty of people today in the Western world that still believe it. Generally people who are not, sometimes they're just crazy anti-Semitic for no rational reason. Often they're people who don't have direct interaction with Jews and Jewish community, but direct positive interaction, that is. Know Jews, connect with Jews, have relationships with Jews. In the Muslim world, where, by the way, the Muslim world generally don't interact with Jews because they threw all the Jews out of the Muslim world. But in the Muslim world, blood libels are widely believed, still today. And many Muslim leaders from many different Muslim countries have repeatedly accused, both religious leaders, political leaders, have repeatedly accused Jews of ritual murder. So yes?
How could we commit murder in a country we don't exist in?
So, well, not of a particular case, but that Jews do it in general.
Well, is there any
So-
proof anywhere that we do it?
So that's the thing. It's not about whether there is proof or there isn't proof. Having to debate about whether it's true or not itself is offensive and outrageous.
Of course.
So today we don't see blood libels in public, at least in Western countries. It's no longer socially accepted. It's widely accepted that blood libels is an anti-Semitic carnage that should have been left behind in the Middle Ages. But we are seeing, especially in the last few months, we've been seeing this for some time, but especially in the last few months, we've been seeing similar ideas that frankly come from the same evil place. And that is accusations that Jews actively kill young children just because they can, that they harvest organs, the Jewish Israeli hospitals harvest organs, something that gets repeated again and again. And in the last few months, we've seen an accusation that has been repeated by public figures in this country, including members of Congress, including people on television, that figures in the media, that Israel is committing genocide. Now, to be clear, genocide means systemic murder of a particular group. Think Hitler's gas chambers, or Hitler's Einsatzgruppen, who rounded people up, dug holes in the ground, and shot them. This accusation, like the blood libel, is absurd. It's outrageous. You can, not only is it not true, because if Israel would be committing genocide, they'd be doing a pretty bad job at it. But it's not only not true, but it's outrageous. It's offensive. Trying to argue with people and explain why it's not true, or why would they be dropping leaflets telling innocent people to leave if they want to commit genocide, right? Why would they knock on buildings with a small attack first, with a small bomb first, to warn people? Why would they make humanitarian areas? Why would they attempt to encourage people to flee, which allows terrorists to flee in advance, right? So all these arguments themselves, the very fact that you would have to argue it itself is offensive. Because the accusation, once again, like the blood libel, only makes sense if you demonize Jews. If you believe Jews as a group to be capable of intentional murder. Like the beating your spouse accusation that I gave earlier, the accusation itself is offensive. And it's anti-Semitic because it demonizes Jews. It demonizes Israel, but by extension, it demonizes all Jews. And so it's offensive just by its very statement. And anyone who says it is one of two things. Either they're blindly, foolishly repeating things that they're hearing on television from the channels that they watch, or reading on the websites that they read, without putting proper thought into it. And there's a lot of people like that. I recently met a Jew in the community who asked me, why is Israel murdering innocent people? And I asked him, do you believe that? You were in Israel. You know Israelis. You have friends in Israel. Do you think any of them are capable of killing innocent people just because they can? Just because they have a rifle with a trigger? Do you know any Israelis that you know personally that would do that? He said, no. I said, so why do you believe such a thing? How do you believe? Who's Israel? These are people you know. These are your relatives, your friends. He said, you're absolutely right. I said, so why do you repeat it? He said, I don't know. So a lot of people are just repeating it. They don't know why. It makes no sense. They never stop to think about it. But a lot of the people are thinking about it and are aware of it, especially those that are making up these accusations. And it comes from the same place, demonizing Jews. The same anti-Semitism. So blood libel's been around for a very, very long time. There's probably no simple way for us to make it disappear. As long as people demonize Jews, there's people who are going to believe that Jews are involved in ritual murder. People who are going to believe that Jewish hospitals harvest organs of others for use. There will be people who believe that Jews practice genocide. However, the best response to each of these accusations is not to explain why the accusation is wrong, but it's rather to respond that the very accusation is offensive and goes beyond any acceptable discussion, because the accusation itself demonizes Jews. And the accusation is offensive, and anyone who raises the accusation should be outside of acceptable discourse. You can debate maybe how Israel should prosecute its war in Gaza. You can debate maybe kind of different policies, but an accusation such as accusing Israel of genocide accusing Jews of harvesting organs, accusing Jews of ritual murder. All of those are outside of the pale of acceptable discussion because they all, as a prerequisite, require demonizing Jews, describing Jews as being capable of ruthless murdering innocents. Now, that's not to say that people don't do it. There are people out there that do it, unfortunately. But that Jews as a people do it is never, ever been the case and is offensive to suggest otherwise. So I know it's a difficult topic, and I'm sorry to have to, but it's a difficult time of year when we kind of remember Jews generally, and I've mentioned this before, Jews generally don't obsess with the horrors of our history. We remember them, we don't forget them, but we don't obsess with them. It's a mistake, and I've mentioned this before, for Jews whom their Jewish identity is focused on anti-Semitism or the Holocaust or the like. We should focus on the positive parts of Judaism, and yet we have these 3 weeks of year of mourning and this day of Tisha B'Av. We do remember. We do have a time of year. There is a time to remember these things, and we should remember these things and be aware of them. So it's important to, most importantly, remember that despite our terrible history of blood libels, despite anti-Semitism, despite pogroms, anti-Jewish riots, despite attempts of other groups of genocide, of destroying the Jewish people, we are still here. Many people hated us, and yet we're still here. Firstly, there were always many people that supported us, and that's part of the story of blood libels, and part of the story of Jewish history is while there were always people hating us, there were at the same time people who protected us. And at every time that we were persecuted, there were those non-Jews who attempted to help us throughout history. That's important to remember. Not everyone was anti-Semitic, and not every anti-Semite always tried to harm us. Even anti-Semites sometimes had their good moments where they helped us in different ways. But most importantly, we Jews, the Talmud says, are like a lamb among 70 wolves. We've been hated by the nations around us. They've always wanted to destroy us, but we're protected by the shepherd. We have God has always protected us and stood with us. In fact, our survival, the fact that Jews have survived despite being so hated, is miraculous. And more than anything, we need to credit Hashem for taking care of us, ensuring we're still here. We are still here, and we have survived all this time, more than 3,000 years, and we are certain that Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel, will continue to survive and continue to thrive. So again, this coming Monday night, you're welcome to join us. I forgot to mention that after, we're going to have services here at 8:10 p.m., where we'll read the Eichel Lamentations. It's a fairly short service, about a 30-minute service. And then after that, we've been doing this for many years. We show a documentary about a Jewish documentary. We're going to be showing this year a documentary. It's an hour-long documentary called Coming Home, about reunions in, I guess, stories of kind of reunions after horrific incidents. It's going to cover after October 7th, people that came back, hostages, and a group in South America and Colombia, that descendants of conversos who came back to Judaism. And so it's going to some other similar instances. So we're going to be showing that Tuesday night. So you're welcome to join us, again, starting at 8:10 p.m. And the movie will be right after the service. And then next week, I will not be here. I'm going out of town, but I have a replacement. Rabbi Yossi will be speaking. I don't yet have the topic, but he will be teaching here. So we will have the breakfast. We will have the class. And please come back next week.
So the services are on